You're sitting in the waiting room, hands folded tight in your lap, trembling despite the summer heat pressing through the windows. The gas lamp overhead flickers, casting shadows that dance across mahogany walls lined with leather medical journals you'll never touch. You've been here before 3 times this month, but each visit still carries a weight you cannot name. The door opens. Dr. Carter calls your name. You rise, smoothing your skirts with gloved fingers that won't stop shaking, and follow him into a room that smells of lavender oil and something else. Something you recognize but cannot, will not, name. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore doesn't know that across London, across England, across the Atlantic, in America's growing cities, thousands of women just like her are walking into offices just like this one. She doesn't know that what's about to happen to her is happening to them, too. All she knows is the insomnia that won't break, the suffocating tightness in her chest that makes breathing feel like an act of will, the irritability that makes her snap at servants, the trembling that seized her at a social function 2 weeks ago and left her gasping, flushed, requiring her husband to escort her from the room in dignified silence. I'm genuinely curious to drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. It amazes me that a story this buried, this strange, connects with people everywhere. Dr. Edmund Carter doesn't waste time on pleasantries. He's young, modern in his thinking, the kind of physician who reads the latest journals from Germany and France. He listens to Adelaide's symptoms with a pen scratching paper, occasionally nodding with grim recognition. Then he speaks the word that hangs between them like a diagnosis of doom: hysteria. The word is ancient, borrowed from the Greek's hystera, meaning womb. But the treatment Dr. Carter is preparing has become something uniquely Victorian, a practice so widespread that by 1890, physicians will estimate that 75% of American women suffer from this condition. 3 out of every 4 women. That's not a disease. That's most of the female experience being turned into pathology. Adelaide changes behind a screen, her heart hammering. When she emerges wrapped in a white sheet, Dr. Carter has already arranged his instruments: bottles of scented oil, soft cloths, an expression of professional concentration utterly devoid of impropriety. The examination table is cold leather. She lies back. He positions himself between her legs and begins to apply the oil with measured, deliberate movements. At first, it feels clinical, medicinal, cold. Then his fingers begin to move with greater purpose, rubbing in circular motions, pressing deeper, finding points of sensitivity she didn't know existed. She wants to speak, to object, but no words come. He hasn't asked permission for any of this. He simply proceeds as though this were any standard medical examination. The sensation building within her is alarming, overwhelming. Her breathing becomes shallow. Her muscles contract involuntarily. And then a sudden, violent release. Her back arches. Her hands grasp the table's edges. For a moment, everything dissolves into an explosion of pressure and relief, and something so foreign to her lived experience that she couldn't name it if her life depended on it. When it's over, she lies gasping, skin flushed, body trembling with something that feels dangerously close to pleasure. Dr. Carter steps back, already writing notes as though he'd merely checked her reflexes. "Excellent," he says, almost to himself. The paroxysm was quite pronounced. "You should see immediate relief. I'd like to see you again next Thursday." Here's what makes this moment almost unbearable in its irony. Dr. Carter genuinely believes he has just performed medicine. He will go home tonight to a wife he believes has no sexual desires. He will write about this treatment in medical journals. He will teach it to younger physicians. And he will never, not once, recognize what he's actually done. The roots of this systematic blindness stretch back 2,000 years. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, looked at women suffering from anxiety and seizures and concluded their wombs were literally wandering through their bodies like lost animals. Plato described the uterus not as an organ, but as an animal within an animal, possessed of its own will, desperate to fulfill its reproductive destiny. If a woman remained unwed, If her womb received no regular attention, it would grow angry. It would rebel. And the woman would suffer. By the Renaissance, physicians had begun dissecting female cadavers and discovered the uncomfortable truth. The uterus doesn't actually move. It's anchored by ligaments and tissue. There's no mechanism for it to travel. But here's where history takes its strangest turn. They kept the diagnosis anyway. If it wasn't a wandering womb causing the problem, it must be something else about female reproductive anatomy, something inherently unstable and prone to nervous derangement. The symptoms expanded to encompass almost anything: insomnia, irritability, shortness of breath, loss of appetite, muscle spasms, nervousness. A woman could be diagnosed with hysteria for being too emotional or too cold, for showing too much sexual interest or too little. The condition became infinitely elastic, capable of absorbing any behavior that didn't align with narrow definitions of respectable femininity. Victorian medical textbooks taught that women were fundamentally different creatures from men, more delicate, more nervous, organized around reproductive capacity rather than intellectual performance. The uterus was the center of the female body. Everything else was subordinate to it. Medical students learned that the female constitution was essentially unstable, vulnerable to sudden collapse. An unsatisfied woman was a threat. A frustrated woman was a liability. An educated woman, supposedly taxing her reproductive organs by thinking too much, was committing bodily betrayal. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you begin from the assumption that women are inherently nervous, you interpret all their complaints through that lens, then of course you'll find evidence everywhere. A woman reports difficulty sleeping. Hysteria, she's anxious. Hysteria, she's irritable. Definitely hysteria. Dr. William Acton, one of the most influential Victorian physicians, published his views in 1857 with characteristic bluntness. The majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. This became medical doctrine, the idea that respectable women had no sexual desires whatsoever. They might tolerate sexual contact with their husbands as marital duty, but the notion that they could experience pleasure was considered not just unlikely, but medically impossible. Here's the profound paradox. Physicians acknowledged that hysteria affected millions of women. They documented the symptoms meticulously. They recognized these women were suffering. Yet they remained completely blind to the most obvious explanation that these women were experiencing symptoms of sexual frustration while living in a society that denied female sexuality altogether. By the mid-19th century, physicians had settled on their standard treatment: pelvic massage. The theory seemed straightforward within the logic of the time. If the uterus was creating nervous symptoms through its restlessness, the solution was to induce what they called a hysterical paroxysm through manual manipulation of the genital region. The procedure followed strict protocols. The woman would be instructed to remain quiet. If she vocalized, she was reassured this was therapeutic. The physician maintained clinical demeanor throughout, discussing symptoms and progress as though commenting on blood pressure. Everything about the environment, high ceilings, medical charts on walls, strategic sheet placement was engineered to support the pretense that nothing inappropriate was occurring. The face was covered so both physician and patient could pretend this wasn't happening. Some physicians kept detailed records documenting not just the treatment but patients' responses, written in clinical language that meticulously described the physical manifestations of orgasm without ever using that word: muscle contractions, flushing, rapid respiration, vaginal lubrication. Each observation recorded in the detached tone of scientific observation. Dr. Nathaniel Highmore, writing in 1660, described what he observed. The afflicted woman would experience violent contraction and relaxation of the muscles, accompanied by flushing of the face, a feeling of heat throughout the body, and in many cases a copious discharge of secretions, followed by a state of profound relief and calm. This description is clinically accurate. It's also a perfect description of an orgasm. But Victorian physicians could read this and not recognize it because their medical education had essentially erased female sexuality from existence. Medical textbooks showed detailed drawings of male reproductive anatomy, but treated the female version with remarkable vagueness. The clitoris was barely mentioned, if at all. Some texts labeled it vestigial, essentially useless. Others omitted it entirely. Physicians received their entire medical education without ever learning that this small structure was a center of sexual sensitivity. They literally didn't know it existed in any functionally meaningful way. Dr. Russell Troll, writing in 1903, complained extensively about the treatment's demanding nature. Achieving hysterical paroxysm, he wrote, could require up to an hour and a half of continuous manipulation, making it among the most tedious and exhausting of medical procedures. Think about that. Trained physician with medical authority complaining about how physically tiring it is to manually stimulate women to orgasm. And he had no idea that's what he was complaining about. He genuinely believed he was performing medical duty. It was simply exhausting work. The problem he identified the exhaustion would lead to one of history's most unintentionally ironic inventions. By the 1880s, some physicians began experiencing occupational strain. A man doing pelvic massage on dozens of women per week, sometimes for over an hour per patient, develops serious hand and wrist problems. Dr. Joseph Mortimer Granville was one such sufferer. His hands were giving out. So in 1883, he did what any clever engineer would do when faced with repetitive manual labor: he mechanized it. He developed a device called the percussor, powered by an electromagnetic engine, capable of producing rapid vibrations at adjustable speeds. Granville initially insisted his device was meant for treating male muscle disorders, but physicians working with female patients quickly recognized its application. Why spend an hour massaging when you could achieve the same result in 10 minutes with a vibrator? The technology spread rapidly. By 1900, vibrators were being manufactured by dozens of companies. The Weiss Company catalog from 1906 offered more than 20 different models. There were handheld vibrators, devices on mechanical stands, floor models with multiple attachments, vibrators that could be attached to furniture, specially designed chairs with built-in vibrating mechanisms. The Chattanooga vibrator advertised that it could relieve hysteria symptoms in under 10 minutes. The White Cross electric vibrator promised the essence of life itself, delivered to your very door. These weren't niche medical devices. By 1900, the vibrator had become the fifth most common electrical appliance in American homes, more widespread than electric fans or electric lights in many communities. Sears and Roebuck advertised vibrators in their general catalog. The 1908 Sears catalog featured a home vibrator described as very useful and satisfactory for home service. This is where we enter truly surreal territory. Vibrators were being advertised in women's magazines, sold through mainstream retail, featured in household product catalogs. One 1910 advertisement showed a woman using a vibrator on her face, with text proclaiming, "Vibration is life. The secret of the ages has been discovered in vibration." And through it all, nobody involved seemed to understand what was occurring. Physicians published clinical papers about inducing hysterical paroxysms. Medical journals carried advertisements for the latest vibrator models. Women purchased home vibrators and used them regularly, often with their husband's knowledge and approval, because it was legitimate medical treatment. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. A physician would spend his afternoon inducing paroxysms in female patients, write detailed clinical notes describing the muscular contractions and flushing and relief, then go home to his wife, whom he believed had no sexual desires, and maintain conjugal relations with the confidence that he was engaging in a purely reproductive act. John Harvey Kellogg, the cereal magnate, embodied this contradiction perfectly. He operated a large sanitarium where he treated hysteria with vibrators and electrical devices. Simultaneously, he crusaded against masturbation as a dangerous evil, recommending clitoridectomy as a cure for girls who engaged in it. He never made the connection between the orgasms he was inducing medically and the sexual pleasure he was warning against. The same act performed by a physician with clinical intent was healing. The same act performed by a woman on herself was dangerous and depraved. Yet some women understood. They might not have been able to articulate it in the language of sexuality. That language didn't exist for respectable women, but they understood that these appointments met some need. Diary entries from the era contain hints. One anonymous woman wrote in 1892, "My weekly appointments with Dr. Harrison have quite restored my spirits. I find myself looking forward to Thursday afternoons with great anticipation, though I couldn't explain to anyone why." Women recommended their physicians to each other. Networks formed. Certain doctors became known among women as particularly effective. Some maintained waiting lists with dozens of women requesting appointments. The demand wasn't coming from physicians pushing treatment on reluctant patients. The patients were actively seeking it out. For women whose sexual desires had been systematically denied, whose sexuality had been declared non-existent, this treatment represented something extraordinary. It was the only space in their lives where their bodies were attended to with this intensity, where sensation mattered, where something that felt undeniably good was happening even if it couldn't be named. By 1915, American physicians were earning an estimated $18 million annually from hysteria treatments. $18 million in 1915 currency, roughly $450 million in today's money. This wasn't marginal practice. This was mainstream medicine generating enormous profit. Then everything changed. And the catalyst came from an unexpected direction. Sigmund Freud, for all his problematic theories about penis envy and vaginal versus clitoral orgasms, broke with Victorian medical consensus on one crucial point. He acknowledged that women had sexual desires. More importantly, he recognized that hysteria might have psychological rather than purely physical causes. If the condition was psychological, then manual pelvic massage might not be the appropriate treatment. By the 1920s, American psychiatry was moving away from hysteria as a primary diagnosis. Papers appeared questioning whether traditional treatment methods were truly therapeutic. The medical establishment was beginning to recognize that something was wrong with their fundamental understanding. But the real nail in the coffin came from pornography. By the 1920s, as early pornographic stag films began circulating, vibrators suddenly appeared on screen, being used for openly sexual purposes. This single-shift devices that had been marketed as medical tools, now shown in explicitly sexual context, shattered the fragile fiction that had supported their place in respectable medicine. Once the public could see vibrators being used erotically, it became impossible to maintain the idea that doctors had been employing them solely as therapeutic instruments. The collapse was swift. Sears removed vibrator ads from its catalog by 1925. Medical journals stopped discussing them. Physicians quietly stopped performing pelvic massage. Devices that had been common in medical offices for decades were quietly discarded. A long-standing medical treatment didn't change, its cultural framing did. And once the veil dropped, the practice became untenable. The irony runs deep. It took pornography, stigmatized, marginal, and dismissed to expose a truth that mainstream medicine refused to acknowledge. Hysteria treatment had endured partly because everyone involved avoided naming what was happening. Pornography, unconcerned with professional decorum, stripped away the euphemisms. Although hysteria wasn't removed from psychiatric manuals until 1952, the diagnosis never regained its earlier prominence. The industry built around it, therapies, devices, advertisements, simply evaporated. Women who had long received regular treatment lost access overnight, not because they had been cured, but because the cultural pretense that justified their care collapsed. In a society unwilling to openly recognize women's sexuality, the disappearance of this treatment left many women without the relief they had quietly depended on. Within a generation, the idea that physicians had routinely stimulated women to treat a supposed illness was treated as outlandish. What earlier had been invisible through denial now became unthinkable through cultural forgetting. This episode isn't merely a story of medical error. It's a case study in how culture shapes perception. Entire professions can fail to recognize what they are doing when language, education, and shared assumptions align to render certain truths unseeable. These physicians weren't fringe figures. They were highly trained practitioners, following widely accepted protocols. Yet they collectively misinterpreted what was happening in their own examining rooms. Not out of malice, but through a convergence of social norms, professional consensus, and ingrained blind spots. The scale was enormous. Even conservative estimates suggest millions of women received repeated treatments, sometimes weekly or even more often. An entire commercial and medical infrastructure devices. Professional guidance depended on mischaracterizing female sexual response. When stag films exposed the sexual nature of vibrators, they inadvertently forced a societal reckoning. The collapse of the hysteria industry revealed an uncomfortable truth. Reality persists even when culture refuses to see it. And just as earlier generations overlooked what now seems obvious, there are likely contemporary practices we misunderstand today, still hidden by our own blind spots. The vibrators in medical offices, the vanished diagnosis. The erased history all point to the same lesson. Denial can shape entire systems. But when the context shifts, what was long unseen can suddenly become undeniable.